Showing 55 participants. Okay. Well, good day. I'm Professor Philip Sloan, Professor Emeritus in the program in History and Philosophy of Science and the program of Liberal Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm speaking to you from the John J. Riley Center at Notre Dame. I welcome our domestic and international audience to our webinar lecture and discussion with Dr. Fabricio Bhagatti of the Institut für Geschichte der Medizin of the University of Würzburg and founder and director of the Center for the Study of Medicine and the Body in the Renaissance. The genesis of this lecture began with a small reading group in early modern medicine, science, and philosophy within the Notre Dame HPS program that read and discussed last fall Bhagatti's 2019 book, Physiology of the Soul, Mind, Body, and Matter in the Galenic Tradition of the Late Renaissance, 1550 to 1630. As a result, we were eager to have a discussion with the author. With the marvels of Zoom, we now have been able to arrange this with a wider international audience. This lecture is also a contribution to the new Notre Dame Riley Center Health, Humanities, and Society program. The lecture is also being simultaneously live streamed on YouTube via the website of the Center for the Study of Medicine and Body in the Renaissance. Fabricio Bhagatti is an intellectual historian with a specialization in the history of science, medicine, and technology. He's held positions as postdoctoral and research fellow at the Warburg Institute of London, the University of Exeter, the Folger Institute of Washington, D.C., and the Edward Worth Library. He is currently senior research fellow at the Institut für Geschichte der Medizin at the University of Würzburg, working on 16th century medicine and anatomical method in a project led by Michael Stolberg. He received his degrees from the University of Rome La Sapienza with his doctorate in history and philosophy and history of ideas in 2012 with a thesis on the influence of Galen's medicine and psychology on late Renaissance philosophy. His remarkable production of work since then has included studies in medieval and early modern conceptual history, the history of quantification and reconstruction of scientific instruments. He's explored more broadly the role that classical and medieval philosophy has played in the development of early modern ideas of logic, method, theory of matter, taxonomy, anatomy, and physiology. In developing this research program, he's published monographs on such topics as the problem of form in natural philosophy from Aristotle to Linnaeus. His book on the physiology of soul I've mentioned, and he has in press a major co-authored study of Santorio Santori and the emergence of quantified medicine, corpuscularianism, technology, and experimentalism, 1614 to 1790. A work which promises for the first time in English to bring into clear focus the important contributions to medical theory, experimentation, and scientific methodology of this Paduan contemporary of Galileo. Bhagatti has shown how this individual is one of the most formative of the early modern theoreticians of biomedical science. In addition, he's published numerous articles in leading journals in early modern mechanization, scientific instrumentation, corpuscular theory, Renaissance natural philosophy, Galenism, and Renaissance ethical theory. A separate introduction, I should note, could also be made concerning his work in musical theory with publications and recordings on the sacred music of the Renaissance with special focus on the work of Gregorio Allegri. The topic of today's lecture, Galen on the Natural History of the Soul, will address several aspects of his work on Galenism and early modern philosophy. For so long in the English literature, at least, Galen has been confined to a classic form of early scholarship in the history of medicine, represented by such scholars as Ozai Temkin, Nicholas Manny, Charles O'Malley, and Vivian Nutton. In a long familiar narrative in the general history of science that we may all have been raised on, Galen was the authority overthrown by Vesalius, Harvey, and the medicine and anatomy based on the new mechanical philosophy. In the history of philosophy proper, Galen's name is missing even from the footnotes. What has been exciting about Bhagatti's work is his bringing to light from his study of a wide array of original texts, the way in which a new Greek Galen, based on works recovered only in the late 15th century directly from the Greek, has contributed not only to a revised view of his role in the history of medicine, but also to our understanding of his importance at the roots of modern philosophy, scientific methodology, the history of experimental philosophy, and the development of corpuscularianism. His lecture today will give us some insight into these novel dimensions by an analysis of the importance of the discussions of little-known texts of Galen that entered in this Renaissance wave of translations for the early modern discussions of the soul-body relation and the origins of biomechanism. These positioned neo-Galenic discussions against the reigning Aristotelian scholasticism of the schools. The lecture will last approximately 45 minutes. After this, we'll have an open discussion. You can submit questions in the chat box or raised hand function. And with this, I'm pleased to turn this over to Fabricio with his lecture entitled The Natural History of the Soul, Galenic Themes in Early Modern Philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. It is a wonderful opportunity to discuss Renaissance philosophy and medicine, and is also an opportunity to meet with colleagues around Europe and overseas, over oceans, actually. So I hope to be able to share my screen. Okay. I hope you can see it. Please let me know if you can see it. Good. So I'll start with a quote, which is in Spanish, but I'll translate it immediately, so don't be scared. En muriendo, Galeno es cierto que descendió al infierno y vio por experiencia que el fuego material quemaba las ánimas y no la podía gastar ni consumir. Este médico tuvo noticia de la doctrina evangélica y no la recibió. When Galen died, it is certain that he descended into hell, and so by experience that the material fire burned souls and could not spend or consume them. This physician had knowledge of the evangelical doctrine and did not accept it. This quote comes from a marginal note on a passage discussing the immortality of the human soul, yet is not the self-righteous tirade of a theologian or the consolatory trope of a moral philosopher. It is the statement of a physician in a medical book. While its author, Juan Huarte de San Juan, 1529-1588, remains an obscure figure, his work, Examen de Ingenios para las Ciencias, the examination of human wits by the sciences, became in the turn of a few years one of the most sought-after yet controversial European bestsellers. In his work, Huarte reclaimed for Galenic medicine the possibility to recognize, categorize, select, and eugenically control human innate abilities, thereby putting in the hands of the monarch a tool efficacious in maintaining social peace, all the while promoting the ingenuity and productivity of its citizens. In so doing, medicine was put front and center of the Renaissance political debate on sovereignty and the role of the monarchy, backing the latter's claims to absolute power with a scientific base. It is noteworthy that the overall architecture of the examen rests entirely on Galen's quod animi mores, seeking to expand upon and to embolden its central tenet. As for Galen, so in Huarte, the human mind is an organic faculty, entendimiento potentia organica, nature like any other, and thus amenable to therapeutic intervention, restraint, and control. If so, then, how do we make sense of the initial quote? One way to interpret it is a preemptive argument against materialism and atheism to enable the book that might seem to lead to both of these stances to be received more favorably. Huarte is addressing his public, trying to reassure them of their fears. Interestingly, the same fears have remained constant over time and still reverberate with us today. A certain tradition in Western thought has in fact tried, unsuccessfully yet consistently, to exercise the possibility that human rationality could be just and natural if elaborated instinct. Modernity, in particular, has reframed the entire question of human nature in a way that made it impossible for us to recover animality as a part of the self. In a famous Galilean catchphrase, modernity had to remove the animal, rimosso l'animale, so as to get access to the world of mathematics and its eternal laws. The turn required a split between pure rationality and human instinct that was worsened by religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. As a consequence of this turn, the word soul came to mean little to nothing for many of us, especially when framed as part of psychology or the philosophy of mind. It is theologians and priests who talk of souls and eternal life. Modern philosophers debate the mind-body problem, tacitly reenacting the very split that was introduced in philosophy as a reaction to the embodied mind. In the mind-body problem, the former term is implicitly associated with a disembodied monad, independent of nature, society, and history, whereas the body is but a distant concern for the disembodied subject. To grasp how medicine impacted the early modern debate on human nature, now the notion of the soul was transformed as a result of the discovering of Galen in the 16th century, we ought to make ourselves familiar again with early modern medical terminology. In nature of philosophy, the matter is different in religion, the most long-lived conception of the soul was formulated by Aristotle, who conceived of the soul as the first and complete activity, entelecheia e prote, responsible for structuring the organs of the body and their functions, in a process that, from the informing of the conjoined matter of the seed and menstrual blood, leads to the formation of the embryo up to the completely shaped human being. The action of the soul is one with the tissues and organs it shapes, therefore making the body an organon, that is, an instrument of such an activity. Despite this might seem quite a spiritual process, it turns out to be the opposite of what it seems. As an organon of the soul, the mind too, with the possible exception of one single faculty in it that does not really pertain to the domain of a human being, is an organic function. To exemplify this conception, Aristotle claims that the soul is to the body what the capacity of seeing is to the eye. The two are different logically, but inseparable in substance. The entire body is thus shaped by one single act that programs and supervises all organic processes, no matter how differently articulated and spatially located in the body. Medicine thus becomes the central discipline through which we gain an insight into human and non-human nature alike, for nature itself is the life principle, physis in Greek. Furthermore, Aristotle believed that passions are rationalized instincts originating as pre-rational compulsions in the body. On the moral plane, we are animals capable of social life. Our characters are shaped by our social relations, which are in turn part of the political life of the city. Discourse is the mediator of social life, and thus an instrument of rationality which, if properly directed by logical method, can lead us to scientific knowledge. Thus, ethics can teach us how to handle our pre-moral inclinations so as to become better citizens, but passions cannot be suppressed. It is against this backdrop, however concise, that we have to evaluate the influence of Galen as a thinking doctor on the early modern philosophical debate. For it was Galen who, by emphasizing the more material and instinctual components of Aristotelian psychology and ethics, helped to shape much of the early modern libertinism and materialism, via Gassendi up to Montesquieu and Lessing. Three elements that contributed to Galen's long-lasting legacy are worth highlighting in detail. First, Galen denies that the body is presided over by a single soul or activity. Natural faculties are different in kind and cannot be located in a single anatomical place, as Aristotle contended. Our three-parted physiological system replaces Aristotelian and Stoic monism. Rationality resides in the brain, passions in the heart, instincts in the liver. As a consequence, the soul is scattered in multiple faculties, and the body becomes the seat of conflicting inclinations and compulsions. This conception is usually referred to as polycentric physiology or three-parted physiology. 2. Galen stresses the continuity between man and animal. The two differ in degree, not in kind. This is the reason why experiments conducted on chimpanzees, pigs, and sheep can be relied upon in drawing conclusions as to the anatomy of the human body. On the anatomy table, the animal is a replacement of the human being, both morally and physically. 3. Galen claims that passions are irrational and arise prior to any conscious evaluation as to their practical or moral implications. He points to children younger than 3 years old to show that moral inclinations are already shaped differently and are therefore innate. As it appears, the distinctive trait of Galen's nature of philosophy is that it anatomized the Aristotelian conception of the soul by reducing the form of the organic body to the form of its temperaments, so that limbs held to parts and purpose-directed activities turn into faculties necessarily arising from the organic structure of the body. The continuity is rooted a priori in a new definition of form or eidos, seen as the emergent property of mixtures and the substance of the soul, out of which natural faculties, passions, as well as moral inclinations and intellectual abilities arise. Such an approach is backed up a posteriori with some forms of experimentation. The polycentric thesis in physiology is confirmed experimentally by severing nerves, arteries, or brain cavities, thereby showing how the impairment of the organic structure hinders or abolishes a corresponding function in the body. The most spectacular example of this, Galen was a great showman and self-promoter, was the severing of the recurrent laryngeal nerve in pigs, an operation that made them suddenly unable to scream. Symptoms related to acute diseases constitute another set of experiences Galen draws from to show that changes in the organic composition of the body cause not just the abolition of a particular faculty, say the loss of memory, but they are responsible for a twist of character which the person is both unaware of and opposed to. Deliriums are taken as an exemplary case, but effects of phrenitis, poisonous herbs such as Helleborus, and high fever are equally taken into account. Variously re-elaborated, these topics crop up regularly in the Galenic corpus, but nowhere more so than in a little work called Quod Animi Mores, or in English, that the faculties or capacities of the soul follow the temperaments of the body. This is a little pamphlet that Galen wrote allegedly at the end of his career and that conveyed throughout the centuries a picture of his natural philosophy that is both consistent and original. The main thesis of the Quod Animi Mores is that our moral inclinations are predetermined by the physical constitution of our body in a manner that can either make us excel at intellectual tasks or prevent us from developing rational faculties at all. Two kinds of treatment are therefore suggested as a consequence of this. While severe moral training is recommended to those whose bodily constitution is healthy, different forms of medical treatment are suggested to the others, with state-controlled killing reserved to those whom physicians deem beyond medical therapy. It is not difficult to realize why such theses sat at odds with some of the moral arguments of medieval and early modern Christianity. They threatened the conclusions drawn by scholastic philosophers on the substantial unity of the human being and the possibility for individual afterlife, while mercilessly pointing to the fragility and caducity of humans before diseases and death. Worse still, the moral worldview that Galen drew from his medical presuppositions was that the origin of evil is not to be blamed on society or educational formation, but is inherent in the constitution of man. Humanity is thus unredeemable. Before our very eyes lies a world that is both beyond our control and blind to our moral requirements. This last point hinted directly at the core of the Protestant Catholic controversy on predestination, and especially the interpretation to be given to Matthew 22:14, wherein Jesus said, "Multi sunt vocati, pauci vero electi." Many are called, but few are chosen. It is also noteworthy that one of the central hopes of the Christian believer was not to be confounded, non confundar, with the unfaithful and the unelected ones, thereby missing the chance for the afterlife. For the last verse of the In Te Deum, "In te Domine speravi, non confundar in eternum." O Lord, in thee I have trusted, let me never be confounded. It would be easy to characterize Galen's philosophy as committed to a form of biological determinism, but it would also be misleading. For what Galen was actually advocating for was a form of moral elitism, grounded on the selection, electio, of morally worthy individuals in view of their political role in society. Galen had exposed this conception in a work called De Moribus, which survives only in an Arabic abridged version rediscovered in the early 20th century, but the main outlines of his moral thought is highlighted in works such as De Placitis, Hippocrates et Platonis, and in the Fragmentum de Substantia Naturalium Facultatum, were sufficient to motivate his followers to pursue the same directions. Huarte, for one, chose to support this elitist approach with a quote from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, line 129, in which he says, "To few great Jupiter imparts this grace, sed pauci equos amavit." Elect and select are thus key verbs to evaluate an important side of Galen's philosophical aftermath. Huarte's Examen de Ingenius being just one example out of many I shall focus on to stress the continuity of these topics throughout the early modern period. Preliminarily, it should be noted that selection is a process that can be understood in two different yet complementary ways, the physical and the spiritual, which are linked by substantial analogies. On the physical plane, selective is the process that takes place in the body when the blood is purified from its impurities and fat components, so that the finest part of it, the spirit, is separated, selectus, and progressively refined, elixatus, in the heart and the brain to become the material substratum of mental faculties. The process is akin to distillation in alchemy, elixatio, when substances are separated and purified so that the essence, quinta essentia, elixir, is extracted out of the rough material. And so it is that the body itself becomes an alembic, homo alembicus, an image that was first developed by the Persian polymath Avicenna and then appropriated by physicians and alchemists, eventually popularized in the Renaissance by Gerhard Dorn as the image of the Furnax Anatomica. Much like the rough material that has undergone the distillation process, a person can be refined or spirited, or also, to borrow from the French, can be endowed with finesse and esprit, highlighting the ability to grasp the essence of something beyond its material and circumstantial manifestations. By the same token, spiritual selection operates by testing and putting to trial, thereby selecting the most valuable part. The Italian philosopher Antonio Persio, 1542-1612, a follower of Telesio, likens the purest ingenuity in man to the process of fire essay, saggio dell'oro, used in the Venetian mint to test the quality of metals. Similarly, Huarte's examen de ingenios is concerned with assaying, examinare, the value proper to each individual, a process that assigns a quality to them and therefore a specific position within the social hierarchy. As all criteria of value, this examen is both selective and hierarchically structured into positions that correspond to degrees of refinement and closeness to perfection, according to the Doctrina Perfectionum. For some are best suited at completing a certain task and they are therefore perfecti. Some are less so, they are imperfecti. Others not at all, they are deficientes. To be considered valuable, talents ingenious, must be useful to society and therefore limited in number. They are arranged in pairs of opposites, the excellence at one task meaning the deficiency in the other, so that the two compensate each other according to a common measure, justitia, which in turn mirrors the table of temperaments, whereby opposite qualities, hot and cold, dry and moist, compensate each other to reach a perfect equilibrium. It is noteworthy that insofar as a talent is something that stands out, it is a form of excellence or preeminence, it necessarily corresponds to a specific imbalance. For instance, one can have the temperament of the brain hot and dry, and thus be quick at learning and doing maths, but will lack the complementary quality that is good memory or firmness of character, because this latter depends on the individuals possessing the opposite temperament, where moisture prevails. According to Huarte, only once a perfect balance between all qualities and capacities is realized, and this is the body of the sovereign, Philip II of Spain, to whom Huarte dedicates his book. The criterion that adjudicates ingenia is nature, natura facitabilem, which operates the selection of human talents by varying the degree of heat proper to each temperament. Inclinations and abilities are therefore innate and instinctual, as in animals, provided in a limited supply and for a specific purpose. They can be improved with training, but education will never produce anything new by itself, for it will then lack the very instruments on which operate. As a result, the ability to learn is predetermined by the nature of our intellect, which is material. To support his claim as to the materiality of the human mind, Huarte provides examples coming from his personal experience as a doctor in Baeza during the plague that overwhelmed the city in 1566, claiming that he witnessed people's twist of character and rise of new talents, as in the case of a servant suddenly capable of speaking Latin while under the effect of maniac accessions. This point is not a secondary one, for it crops up again and again in a variety of texts by physicians and philosophers dealing with Galen's quod animi mores. For instance, the Italian natural philosopher Bernardino Telesio, 1509-1588, pointed to diseases and pain as the main proofs of the materiality of the soul. When affected by acute pain, in fact, our attention is completely absorbed by the phenomenon. The same happens with intense passions, whereby not only the mind but the pulse, the body temperature and alert are elicited and directed to one object only. An exemplary case is the loss of consciousness, deliquium, whereby the subject is no longer aware of the bodily processes taking place in the organism, which is nevertheless striving after the restoration of the normal functions of the animal. These and other experiences that Alessio discusses in an early work titled That the Animal as a Whole is Governed by One Single Substance of the Soul against the Galen, quod animal universum ab unica anime substantia gubernatur contra Galenum, written in 1565 but published only posthumously in 1590, show his debt to the Greek physician. According to Telesio, Galen was both wrong and right. He was wrong in claiming that there are different souls operating in different organs of the body, yet he was also right in claiming that the soul is material, which is spirit contained in the ventricles of the brain and operating through the nerves in the entire animal. This spirit is endowed with its own sensibility and ingenuity that allow it to select what preserves it and to avoid what hinders its conservation in each animal. This selectiveness starts with the capacity of plants and animals to pick their own food and becomes particularly apparent in their capacity of choosing their own partner and reproducing themselves without training, a didacton. Hence, the fundamental force to which all animals are subject to is their self-preservation, cura sui, which manifests itself into complementary compulsions, those toward food and sex. These are both irrepressible and uncontrollable compulsions. As a sentient animal, man too is subject to these very forces. Each individual seeks to preserve themselves by avoiding what is dangerous and seeking what is pleasurable. Yet such reactions are not conscious responses to external stimuli. They are rather instincts which we become aware of, consciousness being nothing but the manifestation to us of what has already taken place in the body, hence predetermining our reaction to the external world. In short, the mind is nothing but an amplified sense perception, with the consequence that the morals too are not shaped by rational decisions, but follow inclinations and abilities that have been predetermined for us at birth. As for Huartes or Intelesio, training can develop a latent ability without creating anything anew. As it appears, Telesio's conception of the rapport between consciousness and instinct follows the directions of the Renaissance debate on occult and manifest phenomena. In this debate, Telesio denies the occult and plays down the manifest, reducing both to different effects of the same cause, namely the motions of the material spirit. As a material substance, spiritus, is affected physically by two opposite forces, the expansion caused by heat and contraction caused by cold. All the properties we witness in nature are the result of these elemental forces, directed by the inner ingenuity of the spirit, which is an ingenium, spiritus ingenium est, towards the achievement of particular goals. Remarkably, Telesio sees these forces at work in the human body and explains the reaction of the nerves to external stimuli and their conveying information to the brain as a series of circular movements of expansion and contraction. It is a process called antiperistasis, whereby the spirit increases or decreases in volume, causing reactions like the movement of muscles, pulse, passions, dull or keen intellect. Brain cavities are the main reservoir of spirits, where the spiritus reaches its maximum volume and, as such, it manifests to us as consciousness. Bodily processes are thus triggered by motions of expansion and contraction, that is, by changes in volume that are in turn a consequence of the intensity of heat. This vision of heat, which some interpreters have tried to trace back to the influence of Stoic philosophy, is in fact a cornerstone of medical thinking and is emphasized by Galen in particular. The reasons why heat was so important in medicine are not difficult to recount. On the one hand, heat was regarded as one of the fundamental properties distinguishing the dead from the alive, homeothermy being a phenomenon peculiar to living organisms. On the other hand, the majority of substances humans need to keep themselves alive require to be heated in order to be digestible or simply useful, cooking food and melting metals being two amongst a variety of possible instances. Another reason why heat is given a special place in medical literature comes from induction, for most natural transformations are exothermic in kind, that is to say, they produce heat. In this sense, temperature, temperamentum, temperatura, temperies, meant as the quantity of the active component in any mixture, natural as well as artificial, was central to ancient physics. Put together, these instances suggested a conception of the body, as we have already seen, as a kiln, whereby substances were purified and selected by separating them into vapors, fuliginous, humors, humores, and spirits, spiritus. The source of heat in the body was the heart, seen as the analogous to fire. These considerations help us introducing another author who dealt with Galen and actually wrote a manifesto of Galenic psychophysiology, the Italian physician Eustachio Rudio from Belluno, 1548-1612. To be sure, Rudio is a minor figure of late Renaissance Galenism who happened to work in Padua, the most important medical university in Europe at the time, where he had as a pupil none less than William Harvey. Unlike his contemporaries, however, Rudio does not intend to integrate Galen's teachings with discoveries made in anatomy by Vesalius, Falloppia, and Acquapendente. He wants to defend Galen's view on the soul against all its detractors. Rudio's work, published under the title of A Book on Soul, Liber de Anima, as you can see in the screen, is thus a manifesto of Galenic materialism, strengthened by borrowing selective aspects of Aristotle and Democritus' philosophies. According to Rudio, not only does the body as a whole need heat to keep itself alive, heat shapes every function of the body from the first formation in the embryo and the womb. Human generation is then likened to the generation of plants and worms, which according to Rudio are originally shaped by generatio ex putri, that is, out of the putrefaction of organic matter. The heat so generated is a mere quality, and it needs the heart to be constantly regenerated and supplied anew to all parts of the body via spirits and the blood. Much as in Telesio, heat produces changes in the volume of spirits whose refinement produces in turn elevated mental capacity, eventually triggering the movements of the muscles, both voluntary and involuntary. Yet, unlike Telesio, Rudio denies the capacity of self-preservation to it. Ingenium is not present in matter since the beginning, but develops necessarily as a result of its multiple transformations. The system so developed by Rudio makes nature almost completely blind to human needs. It is noteworthy that Huarte, Telesio, and Rudio all admitted a kind of intelligence that is both immaterial and immortal. They call it variously anima ad immissa, anima ecelitus de lapsa, or simply anima immortalis. They did so as a matter of faith, not as something can be argued by reason. Incidentally, this is the main cause why their works, with the exception of Rudio's, were censored by the Catholic Church and this is the main cause why their works, with the exception of Rudio's, were censored by the Catholic Church under the formula donec juxta regularum forma repurgentur, and thus placed in the index of prohibited books. Indeed, admitting a supernatural soul without being able to demonstrate its necessity, and in fact denying the possibility for the human mind even to conceive of such a necessity, was taken as an attempt at saving with verbal tricks and empty claims a thought that naturally lends itself to materialistic and atheistic conclusions. So, how did early modern physicians and philosophers put up with Galen's claims? An example of the kind of reaction Galen could provoke amongst his readers is exemplified by the French physician Nicolas de Nancel, 1510-1588, who plainly accused Galenists of atheism and libertinism, adding Galen's name to the list of libertini, acristoi, sadducei, credulones, and so forth. An eclectic Aristotelian like Francesco Piccolomini, 1523-1607, who taught natural and moral philosophy in Padua as a rival of Jacopo Zabarella, remarked that had Galen not provided his works with reliable experiences, his entire Ars Medica would have been useless, for he was blind to anything that transcended the physical domain of the body. Similarly, in his Temporis Partus Masculus, 1602, Francis Bacon criticized Galen for admitting that only nature could create the innate temperament and man could do nothing to alter it. In any case, by the mid of the 17th century, Galen had ceased to command obedience as a medical authority, although this was neither a complete collapse, as often portrayed, nor did it correspond to a loss of interest in his works. As said, the topic of Galen's Quod Animi Mores was deeply contentious and at odds with the requirements of the mechanical philosophy. The grounds on which mechanical philosophers, following the likes of Galileo and Descartes, rejected the vision promoted by Galen and his followers were also moral. The human subject could not be an object like any other in the world, for this would have compromised the moral autonomy required to divorce the past and thus build a new world by means of new technology. As Descartes has it in the initial lines that open Le Monde, this mechanical world is new because, while similar as to its phenomena to the real one, it opens up countless possibilities to human workmanship. Unlike the elitist project of the Renaissance Galenists, there is an underpinning. The constitution of the new world is not restricted, at least not in principle, to the enlightened few, but is both universal and universally spread, le mieux partagé, says Descartes, much as common sense, bon sens, is amongst lay people. By the same token, reason is absolute and requires absolute command and removal of any limit hindering its progress. And so it happened that by the mid of the 17th century, the body-centered natural worldview yielded to the machine-centered worldview, wherein everything is manifest and apparent insofar as reason, spreading everywhere its light, turns the complex into the simple, and qualities into quantities, so that the body is reduced to parts, matter to atoms, time to the uniform beating of the pendulum clock. However, the process that turned the body into a machine was complex, gradual, and far from a complete success. As to the life sciences, it took place first in anatomy, and then it was applied to physiology. Italy offered the ideal setting to this new development at the superseding of Galenism because the Italian humanist tradition allowed the rediscovery of Galen's anatomical texts conducted directly from the Greek originals, a practice that then grew to full bloom in Padua, where Galen's teachings were pondered against their real bearings to human anatomy. Galen's Anatomicae Encheireses, Anatomici Administrationes, or anatomical procedures, show a body disrobed into pieces, whose relevance lies in their specific position, shape, and connection to each other, rather than in their function or utility. The nature of theologian that in the Usupartium had celebrated the function and arrangement of the body as consistent with divine providence revealed himself to be a materialist to whom nature meant nothing more than a cunning assemblage of parts. Andreas Vesalius was the first to realize this, and his De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, never displays the human figure as a whole, which yields to a series of pieces from the larger to the smaller in a move that leads to the progressive miniaturization of the body. To classify them, Vesalius and the Paduan anatomists still rely on Galen's method, but with a view to select those aspects of it that best fits a new vision of the body. The body started being seen as an aggregate of parts, and the most important question physicians could ask about it was not how it mirrored the divine wisdom, but how parts work together in order to generate life. In this context, the very conception of the matter of the body changed. Borrowing from Galen's list of ill-composed parts, male compositiones, authors such as Girolamo Fabrici d'Acqua Pendente, Paolo Sarpi, and Santorio Santori classified parts according to three specially ordained criteria, that is, position, shape, number, situs, figura, numerus. The body thus ceases to be seen as a self-contained unit, namely as a place wherein it was possible to locate parts, and became the aggregate of specialized and quantified organic parts, all of them provided with their own magnitude, magnitudo, and outline, figura. This specialization of the parts in themselves was brought about by upholding the Galenic concept of form as temperament, that is to say, the inherent property of homogeneous bodies, humors, tissues, nerves, flesh. The body could now be conceived as a progression of forms, but of material forms, namely as an interlocked series of shapes, with the simplest contained in the more complex ones along the order of containing parts. With Santorio, this very process ushered into a new way of conceiving matter, as originally provided with quantity and shape, thereby morphing an anatomical method into a corpuscularian theory that underpins Santorio's invention of precision instruments and quantified experimentation in medicine. As Santorio contends, in fact, corpuscles come about by a process of information, whereby the form acts on a tridimensional prime matter by separating it into unities that are spatially located. In so doing, Santorio reasserted the main difference between atomism and corpuscularianism, which indeed rests on the role played by the forma, in natural generation. As Santorio clarifies in his work 15 Books of a Method to Avoid All Errors That Happened in Medicine, 1603, qualities are extracted out of prime matter by the intervention of a form that defines, definite, provides with borders. The undefined matter, so it is a definition of the undefined. Most notably, the form operates by confining the continuous units of prime matter into numerable self-contained units, numerus, therefore providing them with shape, or better still, with an outline, figura, and with position, situs. The very act of informing is hence simultaneously an act of dividing the undivided, that is to say, prime matter, into portions, particulae, or units, corpuscula, that are generated by following the directions imparted by a rational principle, forma. In this sense, the very concept of particle, particula, results from a procedure of division and composition akin to the anatomical one, that is the famous resolutio and compositio. over the anatomy table, the knife in the hand of the anatomist acts as the form. It divides self-contained units, that is, limbs, organs, and apparatuses, into parts, which, depending on the level of analysis pursued, can be reduced further to specimens of smaller and smaller dimensions, from partes to particule down to particule minime. But Galen informs Santorio's approach on much a deeper level, for it allows him to reclaim the model of the clockwork, whereby the three-parted Galenic system of physiology is transformed into three independently moving parts. Start of the quote. The living body can be adequately compared to a clock and to a zither. To a clock, because even if the spring and the gear wheels are correctly arranged, it suffices that a single tooth of any wheel is broken, for which all the operations of the clock are interrupted. Analogously, if only one of the animal's natural or vital functions is interrupted, all of them are hindered or greatly affected. The living body is also compared to a zither, because if only one of the main strings is stretched more or less than necessary, the whole harmony is destroyed. End of quote. This peculiar term that Acquapendente and Santorio imparted to Galen's anatomy was possible because, in substance, the anatomical method was a logical method and represented a way of thinking well before being a way of cutting and handling specimens. As I try to show in this lecture, Galen's legacy could be interpreted differently by different authors. On the moral plane, it suggested an elitist and materialist approach to the mind and the distribution of talents amongst humans. In natural philosophy, it suggested to look at the transformations of matter as the source of ingenuity, both in human and non-human animals. Finally, on the strictly physical plane, his teaching provided the conceptual tools that opened up the possibility to think of matter as a substance of porous texture, although Galen himself had at times fiercely opposed this latter hypothesis. In a sense, however, Galen was never betrayed by his followers. Renaissance Galenists remained faithful to that anatomy of the soul that Galen himself considered as the most distinctive feature of his philosophy, and out of which, eventually, grew out all the questions I discussed thus far. Altogether, these questions underpin the necessity for us to come to terms with that corporeality of the body that modern philosophy has somewhat tried to make us forget, while reminding us that we think because we are alive rather than all the way around. In the light of this, and as a way of conclusion, we are left wondering whether, although refracted and multiplied through the kaleidoscope of its interpretation and developments, Galen's legacy impacted on early modernity less as a medical than as a philosophical authority. And I am confident that could we be allowed to pose such question to Galen himself, better still, if during one of his spectacular vivisections, he would calmly move away from the anatomy table, leave his instruments aside, and then point out to us that the question is ill-posed, for he would say, the best physician is also a philosopher. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this stimulating lecture. I've indicated that people can pose questions in the chat box, and we have several people that that are participating. So please go ahead and do this. We have one question that I can start with here, and we're very pleased to have joined with us Professor Vivian Nutten, who is well known to all of us who work in this area. And the question is, how far is the debate you are describing confined to Mediterranean lands? So there's your...
Thank you for this question, Vivian. Well, pretty much, I would say. For two reasons. The first one is that the discovery took place in Italy more than everywhere else. And also because of how can I say that? It impacted on a problem was discussed as part of the theological debate. The Council of Vienna 1312 and then the Fifth Council of the Lateran in 1516, if I am not mistaken, reasserted that the right position to take was the Aristotelian one. It is to say that the soul is the form of the body. So upholding Galen was seen, and I think rightly so, as a stance against this. So I would say that pretty much was a discussion that took place in Italy and partly in France. I was not able to retrace this discussion in Germany, for instance, which is more abiding by Aristotelian rules, if you like, or England, where the reception of Galen is more scholastic in a way. I don't know if I addressed your question, though.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if there was a response, Professor Nutten. If you need to be sure people be sure they're unmuted if they want to.
Yes, yes. Contribute. Please interact. Please interact.
Yes. You're getting there. We're getting there. I think Fabricio, you're right about the debate not penetrating all that farther north, but one has also got, I think, a much closer, much more detailed knowledge of philosophical Galenism, particularly in Padua and Bologna. And you then do get it to a certain extent in Paris. But one of the big problems is after the Council of Trent, you're getting, if you like, the limits of the debate carefully defined, and that one has to be very careful against anything that might suggest extreme materialism, Epicureanism, democratic, and so on. And this is a particular, in a sense, a very Italian problem.
Indeed, I agree totally. It is not that Galen, okay, let's make this point very clearly. Galen, it is difficult to characterize as a materialist to Cour because he was not. For instance, I mean, it is different. Galen, as the historical physician, is different from his, let's say, reception in the Renaissance Italy. Okay, it's very different. But it's not betrayed, I would say. It could be taken in two ways. One was to take the Quod Animi Mores as the basis for physiognomics, okay, a medical base for physiognomics. The other was another way of looking at it, a new way of looking at it, more radical, more material, where Galen was used as an umbrella, as an authority, and someone to be used to protect you against possible objections. And this materialism is present in Galen, but not extreme. As I said, Galen is not a materialist, he's a moral elitist. And this picture is clear in the De Moribus. It's very clear in the De Moribus. What he says is a radical choice against the most basic pulsions of a human being. This is what he thought, actually. It is a radicalization of Aristotle ethics rather than simply a kind of Epicureanism. But this doesn't mean it could not be taken that way. In fact, it was taken that way. Okay, I don't know if it does, but yes, I mean, I agree totally. I agree totally. It is a way of interpreting Galen.
We have a fairly long question from Evan Ragland, and I think maybe rather than read it, Evan, can you come on and
yes,
state your question yourself here?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Thanks again, Fabricio. It's great to see you virtually and to hear a really fine summary of some of the highlights of your fascinating book, which we've really enjoyed engaging with. The basic question, I think it pushes on and asks you to expand a little bit your most recent response. It's really long, as I said, but I'm trying to develop this. And of course, we've had the luxury of engaging with a longer book. The basic is Galen pretty consistently across his works doesn't take on a strong reductive or materialist line. He always maintains that the diaplasis, the construction of living bodies, can't be material. It's got to be due to some sort of intelligence. It's not clear where this intelligence comes from. And on the usefulness of the parts, of course, he ascribes it to this divine craftsman, and that's celebrated by theists of various religious stripes. But he always has this room for the constructing power can't be material. And that seems to be in tension with these strongly materialist views. So I was wondering how that might fit into your story. And the other part is, and this is more about early modern Galenism as well, when Galen talks about how you're supposed to cure disordered souls or minds, disorders of the passions, but souls and minds are the way people talk about it, particularly in Galen's works or the early modern period. He almost always talks about using taught cures. You have to use reason, discourse, and reason to then master the passions, and through a habitual use of reason, discourse, discipline the passions. It's never kind of a bottom up, or very rarely a bottom up, like a corporeal therapy for the mind or disordered passions or the soul. So how does that fit in the picture, especially since early modern Galenists have really insisted on this, at least the ones that I've read, lots of Galenic textbooks and lecture notes, where they say, okay, yeah, you can have disordered minds or souls. These are fixed by reason, and we're moving on.
Okay, very long question. It is true that Galen proposes two approaches to mental therapy, if you like. The one is discourse, and the other one is therapy. Therapy is highlighted in the Quod Animi Mores, whereas the, let's say, discursive approach is in the Quod Libet Peccatorum Dignazione Curazione, Peccatorum Terrorum Dignazione Curazione. I would say that there is a turn in the Renaissance in the way Galen is perceived, let's say so. And this turn is Huarte. Because many physicians before 1550 took Galen as a Platonist, and so could see his work as a kind of mildly Platonic stance or dualism between let's say, a rationality, however conceived, and the body. This is not what Galen thinks. Anytime that Galen deals with Plato, he completely upsets the equilibriums of Plato philosophy. And the Quod Animi Mores is an example of that. He only quotes Plato to upset the equilibriums in his philosophy. The argument there is that the mind is analogous to other functions, to other faculties, capacities, dynamis of the body, which is a strong argument, analogical, if you like, but strong argument towards its materiality. Yes, there are, so to cut short, there are two ways of interpreting Galen. One is his approach to the mental disorders is discursive. The other one in the Quod Animi Mores is more, let's say, therapeutic in the sense of substances. But there is a turn in the early modern period, and that turn is Huarte. Galen does not conceive of eugenics in terms of, how can I say, a fully fledged program. Huarte does. And he does so by expanding upon the Quod Animi Mores. So each section of the Quod Animi Mores is taken apart and emboldened, strengthened, and amplified. I don't know if that's, I mean, if I addressed your question, please tell me if you would like to.
Yes, sorry, I had it muted so I wouldn't interrupt. No, I think I understand. I think it's great to talk about kind of different layers in the reception of Galen or traditions you're saying. Huarte is definitely an extreme figure and an important figure. But I was wondering how we would place some others, such as Fresnel in his De Abditis, which is 1548. Almost 30 years before Huarte, I think, which is what, 1575?
Yeah.
Yes.
Fresnel presents the Galenist Brutus as a very materialist. So he's got this Brutus as a very materialist who talks about even the formation of things coming about in generation according to the powers of matter. And he contrasts that with a Platonist view. Is that part of the story, or is that something else?
No, it is absolutely part of the story. It's not the only one. Also Piccolomini that follows the same line. I mean, he says, Galen minimizes the role of the form as a teleological process that drives generation, and basically says that everything is contained since the beginning in the temperament. It is complete. It is there is a stronger finalism, if you like, but it's also because it proceeds from the beginning, from the homogeneous bodies, and then shapes everything. Characters, inclinations, as well as function, come not when the structure is fully shaped, are already there. This is since the diviso parts are already there. They are pre-oriented by the temperament. And I do think historically it was Galen who influenced Alexander of Aphrodisia, not the way around. So yes, Galen was seen as a materialist, also by Fresnel, yes. It doesn't mean that he was, but the fact that he denied this big role for the forma, for the Aristotelian ethos, and revised, appending the equilibriums of these philosophies, Plato and Aristotle, was seen as an attempt to materialize this generation in particular. I mean, if you look at it is different if you're dealing with philosophers and philosophers, because philosophers are more concerned with the metaphysical side of this, which is not there in Galen. Galen never developed this metaphysics. At least we do not have much of his works, so we do not know what he thought in terms of metaphysics. He was very concerned with logic in a way. So the big work that we have lost of Galen is the Demonstrazione. Okay. But in a way, philosophers tend to look at Galen as from a metaphysical point of view, and then Galen becomes a part of the Aristotelian picture. Okay, physicians are less concerned with that, and there is a practical problem. They simply do not care about the immortality of the soul, and Galen taught them to not to take care of the immortality of the soul in a way. I don't know if this addresses. I mean, the standard position of physicians at the time, almost all of them, with exception of probably of Fresnel or a few others, who are strongly committed to Christian faith or Platonism, is basically that the immortality of the soul is not a medical matter. But if you see this on the other, I mean, from the other side, it basically means you cannot prove it. And if you cannot prove it, you are basically saying that the conclusions of the councils of Lateran and the other such councils are void. You are basically tacitly accepting that they are a matter of faith, but they cannot be demonstrated.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it fits with what I've seen in some other works, even talking about Northern Europe. I spent a lot of time studying Leiden, about 1575 to 1672. And in their textbooks and their lecture notes, they'll often distinguish between speaking as philosophers, we want to say all of these activities of the soul come from the soul. They're in the bosom of the soul, they flow from the soul, in kind of Fresnelian style language. But speaking as physicians, we're going to talk about the faculties of the parts. And they make this linguistic turn and this distinction in even like the standard institutes textbooks.
Very good. We have a question here from Dolores Lorizzo. Would you like to, Dolores, would you like to articulate yourself, or should I read it? If you unmute, you can speak your question.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're unmuted. Oh, right. Yes.
So I wondered how far the Quadrante Minores got into the medical curriculum in Italy. And one of the things that I've been looking at is how, although there's supposed to be a rejection of Aristotelianism across Europe and in England, actually the Parva Naturalia becomes part of the standard medical curriculum, not only in Italy, but also in England. So I'm wondering to what extent there's an interest in this that gets onto the curriculum in Europe and England.
Thank you, Dolores. The Quadrante Minores was read as part of the De Anima. It's not something that could be read independently. The natural philosophy, that is to say, the science of the time, is Aristotle. So the Quadrante Minores is a discussion that takes place usually as a complementary discussion and comment to the first book of Aristotle, Tripsyches, okay? Not to the Parva Naturalia. It could come across, I mean, during the discussion, Galen thought that, but it's mostly the part where Aristotle discusses the materialist positions on the soul. Then you would likely to find someone say, like, Galen thinks that. For instance, Cremonini addresses this problem as part of his commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle. And he basically says that, I mean, I want to be clear on this aspect. It's not that Galen was, let me formulate this precisely. Galen never formulated his own philosophy for the Renaissance thinkers. He did in his time. He was considered a philosopher, okay? Simplicius said Galen is adored as a philosopher, okay? But what the 16th and 17th century thinkers and physicians take from Galen is an empirical approach. This empirical approach does not stand proof by itself. It's part of a bigger approach, that is the Aristotelian approach to the nature of philosophy, whereby Galen says, look, take out the metaphysical side of it, keep the empirical one. That is good. And a place like Padua, that since Pietro d'Albano is doing this, basically also independently of Galen, I mean, as a matter of Averroism or taking, fleshing out Aristotle in a way that is very materialist, if you like, was very welcome. I mean, Galen was the second pillar. Averroes and Galen were the two pillars on which Venetian Aristotelianism was I mean, developed, was built on. I don't know if I addressed.
So would the De Placitis Hippocrates be part of this commentary on Aristotle Book 1?
No. It is a complementary to that. I mean, Acquapendente says that he read it fully, okay? And this is still part of the discussion on Aristotle De Anima, but more the Quod Animi Mores than the Placidis, because the Placidis is it's a collection of opinions, basically, okay? Yeah. It's very dogmatic. I mean, this is our opinions. It's discussing opinions against which Galen takes a very strong stance, okay? I would say that it's a model of commentary for Telesio, okay? It is, Telesio, De Rerum Natura Juxta Propria Principia is, in a way, is reflective of this way of thinking Galen that addresses topics that are basically Stoic and Aristotelian, refashions them and objects to them. So Giglioni showed that very clearly, I think, that Galen provides Telesio with a model to write and a model to object, to object to in a way.
Thank you.
We have a question from Nicholas Aubin, which really is on Telesio. So, Nicholas, are you on? You want to state it yourself, or I will?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much for this very informative talk. I'm kind of entering this as terra incognita. I work in the medieval Arabic tradition, so I mean, not really familiar with any of these names or any of these, particular concepts you're talking about, but a lot of them very familiar to me, coming from this tradition. In particular, I wanted to get more clear on this animal universum, which you mentioned, I think, in the context of Telesio. I wasn't really sure what, sort of concept that was, whether it matched onto anything like a universal nature or a world soul or anything else. I know we have similar ideas in different philosophical traditions at the time. What sort of function does it serve? Does it really, map onto any of the three partitions of the soul in the either Platonic or Galenic model? Does it map up to anything in any of these other thinkers, or is it a totally different idea from all that?
Okay. The Quod Animal Universum is, let's say, the nucleus of Telesio's philosophy. Telesio's philosophy, if you like, is the metaphysics of the medicine of the time. Okay, is the metaphysical superstructure of the medicine, the Renaissance medicine, the Italian Renaissance medicine. Okay, we can take it like that. But it's very specific. Telesio does not address in that work the constitution of prime matter or how the universe works. He is interested in objecting to Galen specifically, to the point where Galen says the faculties are separated locally and are confined into certain organs. Telesio says no, and uses an interpretation of the ligament of nerves to prove that actually everything is connected. It is a very strong encephalocentric, brain-centric view of physiology in Telesio, which is astonishing from the time. For instance, Cisalpino is still linked to Aristotelian models where the heart is the center of everything. No, Telesio really is the brain, the center of everything. And he objects to Galen that Galen does not understand physiology well because he sees these organs separated. What he thinks basically is a revised version of what Argenterio did before. He's basically saying the most important part of physiology is spirit. Okay? This spirit is contained in the cavities of the brain and is everywhere. But in terms of volume, is there, okay, in the cavities. Okay? And then it moves everywhere. There is only one soul, if you like, the material soul. But this material soul has two basic motions, contraction, expansion. These in turn will constitute for Telesio the material out of which he will extract his vision of the world, where heat expands and cold contracts, okay? It is, in my opinion, but this is just my opinion, the metaphysical worldview that comes out of Renaissance medicine, okay? If you take an author like Cassirer had difficulties in dealing with Telesio because he could not see that he was reflecting, pondering, meditating on the medicine of the time. Telesio is very committed to the medicine of his time. I don't know if I addressed your question, but I tried.
Yes, that's very clear. So I guess it's not anything like a Zoetica dunamis or something like that. It's a different idea altogether.
In the De Natura, he discusses Alexander of Aphrodisia, he discusses Aristotle, but he really picks the side of the physicians. He basically says, look, let's confine the part, everything that is metaphysical, let's find ourselves, how can I say, let's entertain ourselves with the matter of medicine. And this matter is the thermic imbalance that you find in the body, okay? This is what concerns us. And this is the expanse upon this in the entire cosmos.
Would you say that powers still play a role? I mean, does he have these faculties or powers in the system?
Yes, but I think, okay, I can point to a study specific on these. But basically, what is interesting in Telesio is Telesio transforms the concept of dunamis, which is a metaphysical concept, into forces. Okay, this is a real force. There is an impact, okay? It is not a struggle or strive towards something. There is an impact, okay? Telesio is really interesting from the, how can I say, the cosmology of his work, but I didn't deal with that in my work.
Thank you very much.
We have a question here that I've been asked to read by Diana Apatolsky, who says there's construction going on in the background, so she wants me to read it for her. Says, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I would like to know more about Galen's opinion on the connections between the soul and the spirit and how this was received in the Renaissance. Can you say a bit more about this?
Okay, Julius Rocca has written an important book on this, and also Vivian has expanded upon this. Galen deals with the connection between consciousness and spirit in the seventh book of the De Placitis, Hippocrates, and Platonis. There he shows, and I think he's a great experimentalist there, that the soul, the consciousness, not the soul, the rational part, let's try to be precise here. The rational part of the soul, not the soul, the rational part of the soul is located into the brain. But he denies that it's possible to part this rational faculty more precisely, because what he does is what D'Arenberg called experiment with destruction, okay? He takes the cavities of the brain, sever them, okay? Sever them. And then what happens? The animal collapses. But then if you are able to rejoin these parts in the cavities, you see that there is a restoration somewhat of the consciousness in the animal. At least there are some reactions. So he sees that there is a connection, clear connection between the spirit contained in the cavities of the brain and, let's say, the awareness of the animal, because consciousness, I don't know if we allowed animals to have consciousness, but he also says, look, further than that I cannot go, because experimentally I cannot say more. This is very important in Galen because Galen admitted the criteria they called the criterion of scientificity, which consists in saying, look, I need a proof of what you say. Doxa epideikoikmene epistemonikos. Give me a proof that is almost mathematical, otherwise I will stop. Where anatomy stops, I stop my considerations. It's almost like if you like to recall Newton, hypothesis non fingo. If anatomy does not allow me, I won't say more. This is what basically Galen says. He proves that there is a connection to a certain point, that this awareness is confined in the brain. Awareness, because it is different. Galen is different from what we think today, okay? This awareness is located in the brain, but is not certain to what extent the functions can be separated in the brain. That comes much later with Nemesio of Emesa, with others that are not Galen. Galen is clear in what he says. He says, there is consciousness, more I cannot say.
Very good. We have a long question from Taran Baker. And Taran, if you're on, why don't you state it yourself?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. So the short question is it seems like your account of Fabricio da Pendente, Fabrici's, is at odds with, say, Cunningham's account, where he is going after the animal soul. That's his sort of his real goal in doing anatomy is the animal soul, and so he does have this sees the body as unified by the Aristotelian concept of the soul, of course, influenced by Galen. And I personally don't see him more interested in situs figura numerus than his predecessors and going back to the medieval period. So I'm just wondering how you might respond to this and why we're placing him alongside Centaurea, which I think is interesting, but I don't quite see that myself.
Tarin, you are right. But if I address your question, I have to spoil what I'm going to publish in 1 month time for Medical History, for an article that's been accepted for publication. I'll tell you something. Michael Stolberg discovered the unpublished Methodus Anatomica by Acquapendente, 1579. In that work, I found the first formulation, it is an abridged formulation of Galen's criteria that are much, is a longer list than simply situs figura numerus. And there he abridges the list of male compositiones, ill-composed parts, into those 3. And I found that interesting because Paolo Sarpi does the same and Santoro does the same. And I was wondering whether Sarpi was the first one to do so. No, it actually turns out that it did not. And so your question about Aristotle, as you will see in the article, but I won't say much more, Fabrici is an Aristotelian, because he will then reject what is said in 1579 and accept only selective aspect of what is said in the method. The reason is one guy called Jacopo Zabarella, who basically was destructive against Galenists, says these are empiricists, blind empiricists. The kind of proof they give us are analogical. This is not logical proof. This is a kind of analogy. It's a kind of induction, limited in kind, based on very simple, very specific, very contingential events. So you can never base a conclusion, a logical conclusion, on what Galen says or on what Acquapendente says, okay? There is destructive criticism by Zabarella, to which Acquapendente reacts, and Acquapendente basically says, look, I'm not a philosopher, I will confine myself to what Aristotle says. Also because for the kind of project Fabrici is pursuing, Aristotle is more functional than Galen, much more. Basically, Fabrici is pursuing a comparative anatomy. This is a really biologically informed Aristotelianism, okay? This is not much Galen. Galen is a physician. Aristotle pursues this biology, this great project of biology. I hope I addressed, but you forced me to reveal much more than I wanted to.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to reading the...
I'll send you the article. I promise.
Yes, and I'm sure I'll have many questions after that. So thank you very much.
Okay, good.
Very good. We have a question here from from Marina Mitaleva, and about asking about some points. Would you like to come on, Marina, or do you want me to read your question? Well, her question, I'll put it here. Can you recommend literature about Galenic studies in Renaissance Italy until the middle of 15th, and about the influence of Galen on people like Leonardo da Vinci? Now, I'll let you, I know you have an enormous bibliographical mind. So.
Okay, no, everything that Vivian has written about it is good. So look, I'm not going to list, Vivian, if you like to join in, but everything that he has written on that is excellent. Another good head would be Michael Stolberg, who equally wrote on Padua and Italian medicine. For that period, I would say basically it is true. There are other studies that come before that. Can you hear me? Yes. And but these are the most recent and the one that can give you a couple of directions to follow. So look up Vivian Nathan and Michael Stolberg.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see.
Also Irai, but for an earlier period, and not just Italy. It's broader in prospect and scope. Vivian, would you like to interject?
Well, I would just say I still love reading Temkin because he's far more philosophical than I am. But could I just make one comment on Quodamini Mores, which is that, first of all, I've rarely found it in medical texts. It's not one of those they're interested in. It's also one in which Galen himself, if you read it carefully, says, I'm not concerned about what the soul is. Or we can say, whatever you believe about the soul, it is in some way affected by the body. And that's the message. But of course, it easily leads to accusations of materialism. And where you do find that materialism developed, as you said in passing, is physiognomy. And that's when it comes in with medics talking about that aspect of Quodamini Mores. But it's a philosophical text, not one for the medics, so to speak.
In fact, it was part, as I said, of the commentary to Aristotle's De Anima. It was dealt with as part of that tradition. I mean, it's not independent. It did not circulate independently from that. It was a specific question within that tradition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
More specifically, how do we articulate the form-matter rapport? Question mark. Okay, this is where Galen comes in and has something original to say. Okay.
Good. Maybe we don't have another question waiting, so maybe I can interject a comment here that in some ways follows on Vivian Nutton's question, but also reaches back to some questions raised by Evan Ragland about this. And this is a bit of the interpretation reaching back to someone like Fernell, because as I would read Fernell, and even things like his De Aditus and another text, he seems to read, he thinks Galen's being misread by some of those who read him as a materialist. Here's a, now it's an interesting, he gives some quotes here. This is a quote that the editors of this couldn't find a Galenic source, but he claims this is being said by Galen, that the soul is the downflow of the soul of the universe, descending from the heavenly region, capable of knowledge that always aspires to a path like itself and to a related substance, and abandoning earthly things that always aims at the highest points of all, having a share of heavenly divinity, and gazing quite often over the heavenly place that takes its stand beside the governor of things. Now, they said they haven't been able to find this in Galen, but he's claiming that this is what Galen is holding. And I think that, at least in a lot of ways, it seemed to me that he is, I think he's sort of reading much of the people who are taking a materialist or reductivist view out of Quodamini Mores in this work as really misreading Galen, and then he's emphasizing passages in the Deus Partium and so forth. And so it's a question here as to what extent, I mean, it's clear that you brought out very clearly that there are people who in fact do read Galen as materialist, and I think you're particularly on Rudio was your particular point you're making. But my own reading of Galen, if I were, for instance, bring in a text like the De Placitus, for example, it seems to me that Galen is somewhat agnostic about the soul, but he isn't really arguing for any kind of materialist position. So in other words, there's a reading of Galen that's pushing in that direction. And then we have people who would claim to be Galenists, people like Vernel, who's primarily a Galenic physician, saying, look, you're misreading this text. And there's really another reading, which is emphasizing both the natural theology, the design argument, and so forth. And so at least it seems to me that you may be getting some, we can't just put Galen against the traditional viewers as Aristotelians. At least some people seem to see Galen on the side of the tradition and against what might be the materialism that some people are taking from it. But I just wonder if you'd comment on, that point.
It's said that we have to distinguish Galen as a philosopher, as a classic philosopher, from its reception. In Galen times, the religious problem of the afterlife of the individual self was not prominent. I think existed, but was not prominent, because there was not a religious dogma protecting it, okay? So you can make the case, historically, that Galen is, as Vivian said, the point of the Quod Animi Mores is, look, as I see it, okay? There's a particular interpretation within the Aristotelian tradition saying, look, there is not such a thing as an individual immortal soul. There is an eternal soul that is basically, impersonal, and then all the rest is material. I think you might construe credibly the position of Galen that way, okay? Because he basically builds upon the Aristotelian concept of the soul. Very different picture you find in the 16th century. There are two resolutions of the councils of the Catholic Church. It's the controversy with the Protestants, and the problem with the individual afterlife is prominent. Then Galen is a materialist because he denies, since everything, is predetermined, and the individuality that you claim to have is affected in important ways by the constitution of your body, then the only possibility for you to have an afterlife is this kind of pantheist vision, okay? And it's not, by chance that Rudio, Huarte, and all these people I mentioned, they accept an immortal soul, but by faith. Then you can put there whatever you like. But in terms of arguments, you have no arguments. Medicine is the argument. And also it is a way to use Galen as saying, look, this is what you have to look at, okay? And since you cannot find any proof here, neither you should be looking at it, because the question is not of medical relevance, of medical import, then simply you can go without. And this is, libertinism, materialism is also this. You're saying, look, I believe that by faith. It is a way of disengaging, after all. I don't know if, maybe it's controversial, but I look at it that way. You simply don't engage. It's a matter of faith.
That would give a certain, just to follow up a little bit, that would certainly give a context to the urgency that someone like Descartes would see in proving the existence of the soul as separate from the body and not simply taking it as a matter of faith.
Individual soul, ego cogito.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
The individual soul, because he says it is a substance, but it's an individual substance. He says it's a substance,
right.
But it's an individual substance.
But it would, but against this background you're talking about, it would say that, look, okay, these previous arguments have not been sufficient. They've relied on faith, and I'm going to be able to prove this. He seems to set this out in the opening of the justification of the meditations. He's going to prove this rather than simply say it. We have a couple of other questions. Yeah, good to come up. I see Dolores Lorizzo has said, Dolores, would you like to give your question yourself? Yes.
Since you're such a font of knowledge, Fabricio, maybe you can help me understand this trend of early modern philosophers adopting the Nemesian theory of the pneumatic ventricles. And so, but also they want to take on lots of Galen on therapies of the passions, lots of Galen on physiology. And so I'm wondering if there's a tension between Galen on the ventricles and Nemesius on the ventricles. And the reason I ask this is that it has a huge impact for the classification of knowledge in terms of what kinds of things can be explored by the imagination, by memory, by reason, by induction, by instinct. And I wonder if you have some views about this.
Oh, thank you. I'll try to be quick here. If you take Huarte classifies memory, imagination, and so forth and so on, but he says, look, I don't believe those who locate it in the brain, in specific parts of it. The same does Rudio. Rudio says, yes, you can divide them, but this is more opinio recepta than something consistent. I mean, Acquapendente wrote a treatise on, is now lost, on the Fantasia Intellecto or something like that, but is not so keen on the particularization, let's say, of the faculties. It is more a way of classifying functions than it is a way of classifying parts of the brain. This localization of the faculties, something goes pretty much on in the late Middle Ages, okay? Albert the Great and so forth and so on. But as soon as, I mean, Vesalius and Berengario and others start recovering these experiments on the brain, although Vesalius not much on the brain, to be honest, but others, for instance, I don't know, Fanopi and others, then there is this approach that we are not sure. And they see that Galen himself wasn't sure about the localization of this function. So they are a bit skeptical, I would say. Huarte is one of says, the physicians say that can be, cannot be, is not something that solves the question, okay? I don't know. As to the tension between Nemesius and Galen, this is a question for Vivian Nuttall. I would say no, because Nemesius basically thought he was being Galenic in a way. But there are 2 centuries apart. Right? There is a question, I think, from Evan Ragland. Am I right? Sorry if I'm mispronounced.
Yeah, he had a second question. Yes, we can bring this in about Centaurio. Evan, do you want to state it?
He's no longer with us, probably.
Maybe not. Well, look,
Okay.
David Harley has a question. So, David, are you online? Do you want to state your own question? Well, he's asked a question here that he said was following some ways on Vivian's question. When a powerful group of natural philosophers and medical investigators rose in Oxford, it was Aristotle's De Anima that was crucial. Locke taught it as a college tutor. Willis uses a frame for his lectures. In these works, we see 2 different views of what became English psychology, interacting little with Galen or theology. This was a comment here that sort of pushing back on the importance of Galen. Do you have any comments to David on that?
No, I would say that Galen was a standard of medicine. I mean, Aristotle is not a physician. Aristotle provides a theoretical background against which you can read. The theoretical assumptions you have to accept a priori in order to deal with the body. But it's then Galen that provides the actual material for physicians. I mean, Temkin, and I think also Grimek, made the point, which I'm not supportive of, that Hippocrates replaced Galen. This is not true. if you see how physicians are dealing with Galen, still in the 17th century, Galen is central to their understanding of the body. But the difference is this one: they take Galen as a colleague, not as the authority of Galen. Galen has become a colleague, who was wrong in many ways and right in others. I mean, the strongest reaction is against let me phrase it precisely, the scholasticization, let's say, of Galen. That was a strong pushback, meant taking Galen as he said that, ipse dixit. Now, this is no longer acceptable to no one in the 17th century. Yeah? But Galen is not, I mean, there's not loss of interest in his works. He's taken as someone who said something partly wrong, mostly wrong in anatomy, and partly correct as to approach or as to the, how can I say, as to the matter of medicine, okay? Dietetics, for instance. But Vivian is more qualified than I am on this.
Mm-hmm. Good. Taryn Baker has a second question. Taryn, are you online? Do you want to state it yourself?
Yes, thank you. Just very generally, are you aiming for some new account of sort of the scientific revolution, the so-called scientific revolution? Because if you read this together with, say, Craig Martin's Subverting Aristotle, you have this sense in which it's religious reactions to Galen and Aristotle that is really productive of the changes in the 17th century, at least superficially. But I don't know how you might respond to this broader question and the broader narrative.
You read my conclusions. Okay, I support totally what Dan Garber said about this. I found that excellent. I find that deeply inspired. The way they dealt with Aristotle is the exact way in which Catholics and Protestants mix in that period, okay? Aristotle does not disappear. I think it was Alistair Cromby who made the point. It's not true that Aristotle disappeared at all. It remains vital up to Newton. In which way, though? Okay, and I made the point in the book: it is fragmented, contaminated. It becomes an authority amongst others, still Aristotle, but an authority amongst others. And yes, you cannot conflate. No, I'm not pointing at you. I mean, someone cannot conflate all those who are against Aristotle as novatores or as a revolutionaries. There are those who do not agree with Aristotle and follow other classical paths. For instance, this revised form of Galenism, alchemical medicine, some others, Descartes. I mean, they react against, this is what I made as a point in the book, they react against the background, and this background is still Aristotle. Mm-hmm. Because it's very big, it is not all encompassing, but very broad as a philosophy to deal with, okay? It's also present in Jesuit schools, in Catholic schools, also Protestants. Despite Luther criticism of Aristotle resists in those universities. But yes, it is a contamination. What I found difficult to accept, the structuralist approach between, I mean, before and after, I personally find that a bit violent. You know, you have to assert this, and that not even possibly Descartes. I know Ian MacLean made this point, and I was skeptical at the beginning, but he made the point that even Descartes is to some extent un-Aristotelian in many ways, reformed, revised, many ways. I mean, it's not the point of Ian; it's the point of Etienne Gisson. It is the background. First was the front and center of everything, Aristotle. Now it becomes the background, but it's still a very comprehensive background against which there are reactions, contaminations, fragmentation. It's vital for that period. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I mean, this is my position, and I'm not pretending.
I have, let's see, Evan Ragland, he sent this twice, and I guess he didn't. I'm going to read his question just in case he's having trouble with the sound here. He said, I have one more question about Santoro and corpuscularism in chemistry. And Evan, do you want to, are you here? Can you state your question?
I can try again. My microphone's been acting up. It looks like you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic. Definitely needs more work. I really enjoyed your paper in Ambix a few years ago, so thank you for that. I'm just wondering, you have in this particular talk and then the rest of the book, you want to locate Santoro more in kind of this line of Galenic philosophy, and that's fair, like for the theme of the book. But why should we locate him in kind of this line of empirical anatomy, and then thinking about bodies as these kind of nested material forms, and subdividing the bodies helps us understand them based on their component parts, when we already have a real strong traditions of syncresis, diacrisis, decomposition, composition, and chemistry. I mean, if you follow Bill Newman's line, which I think is largely persuasive, goes back to the 13th century with Pseudo-Geber Summa Perfectionis, has a big life. In the 1500s, we have Scaliger, Drug and Meteorology, and on Fracastoro. So there's a lot of stuff in the air about breaking bodies down, even in medicine with Fracastoro, breaking things down into component parts, or even for Fracastoro atoms. So then why connect Santoro so closely with anatomy here? Is it method?
This is an excellent question. I'd like to discuss this in more detail. I will do, but I don't want to monopolize the entire discussion. First, Santoro rejects internal remedies. He believes that alchemical medicine is practiced by assassins because they're too strong, these remedies, and they kill. He follows the Hippocratic motto that you have to do nothing if you do not know what to do, or always choose the mildest form of medicine you have first. Second, Santoro is interested in quantification. And the quantification requires you to look at things structurally. Okay? I'm not sure that Paracelsus came up with something that even by far resembles what Santoro has in mind. Okay? Santoro is trying to say, look, there are structural properties of matter which are primordial up to a certain sense, because he's a corpuscularian. And by measuring the variation of the structural changes in the body, situs figura numerus, you can then measure something. This is what is attempting at doing. Okay, it is something different. There is someone else who does the same as Santoro at the time. It's Angelo Sala. Okay, he's a iatrochemist. And he does that on the account of the reductio ad pristinum statum, okay? How you can come back to the original substance, and you need to reconstitute the ingredients anew, and then you must enumerate them precisely. So quantity becomes vital. In the case of Santoro, quantity comes about as a specific Galenic problem. We have to quantify the magnitude of a disease, because this is the difference between us, Santoro says, and charlatans. Charlatans take broad indications, okay? They will tell you more or less what's going on in the body. I want to be precise. In order to be precise, I have to follow method, and then arrive at a point where I can exactly quantify the disease. Not as everyone does in a way that is more or less precisely the pulse, the temperature, because then I can standardize. Okay, he makes very clear this point. He wants, to a certain extent, replace the subjective approach of the physician with the technical approach. He says it's not always possible. It is possible to a certain extent, but it's what he has in mind. I think they're very different things. I mean, the spiritual in Santoro, it is difficult to find. It's very down to earth. I don't know if this clarifies or makes more complex the things, but.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. And Angelo Sala does seem like a good exemplar. But you're right that for the Paracelsians, for the most part, and certainly Paracelsus, I don't see that many similarities. But there's a lot more, particularly Aristotelian chemistry, that I would want to look at, but you've probably done more looking already. But this fits, particularly with Santoro and his development of the thermometer and the posologium. I mean, that definitely is good to keep in mind. So thank you.
Thank you.
We really, that's pretty much filled all the questions. I had one short question from Nicholas Aubin, if you'd like to state that, Nicholas.
Yes, thanks. And thanks again for the opportunity to ask this. in the period history of thought where I work, one of the major, charges in the battlefield of ideas was that the astrologers, the astronomers don't really know what they're doing. They have the pseudoscience. Maybe there's some theoretical basis for it, but they can't actually do what they're doing. And, it always struck me as a bit odd that this, astral medicine, this tradition would be on critical days or something like that, where, the influence of these heavenly bodies is called upon to explain certain medical phenomena. It seems to presume a certain theory of the soul, or a certain way in which the soul is at least susceptible to these influences. And I'm wondering if that same, nexus of traditions is active in this time period. Are the people who look at the kind of dynamic going on critical days and draw on arguments there?
Okay, Nicholas, thank you very much for this question. I have to confess that your same hypothesis, so taking on critical days by Galen as an example or as a direction to follow with respect of Santoro, was my first hypothesis, but it revealed not to be the correct one. Astromedicine, or let's say so, this kind of prediction based on the movements of the stars is what you find in the 14th century, for instance, in Pietro d'Abano. It is still strong in the first part of the 16th century. Then there is this debate that Fernel brings about on occult qualities, and Paduans react strongly against. Not only against the debate, but also against Fernel. The idea that innate heat is divine, they say, Cremonini, for instance, no root whatsoever in Aristotle or anything we are concerned with. And also the problem of occult qualities. It's not only Galileo that denies that, also Santoro. The occult seems to, I want to be specific also here. The problem of occult qualities in the late Renaissance hinges particularly on a problem the scholastic had. It's called actio realis, okay? Whether a substance can act independently by material accidents. It's called the quaestio de actione reali. And the Paduans are strongly against this. They follow Thomas Aquinas. They say, no, it is impossible. The English tradition, Occam, said, no, this is possible. This is the potentia absoluta. All the Paduans react strongly against this, okay? There is not the potentia absoluta. There's nothing that can act beyond or besides or over independently from material accidents. And for these conditions, also they approach the soul, okay? Because they see this as the soul and the body. It is a question of actio realis, how the soul is knowable through the body. So that tradition of the critical days starts being seen critically, let's say so, to say the least of it. But it was my first hypothesis, I mean, because I was also following the studies on Hippocrates that basically uses the same kind of device. I don't know, when you have to account for cyclical diseases, you look at the seasons. And I thought it was a proto form of quantification, but no, it's not the one this Santoro and others are following. They are following another path. And this path is the magnitude of a disease. You have to quantify the magnitude of the disease.
Thank you.
Well, we've pretty much cleared the question box. Does anyone that hasn't spoken like to raise any final questions or final comments on this? Please do so now. Just unmute yourself and identify yourself. Well, it looks like that has been...
Someone will not find a way to speak, unfortunately, but it was simple. If you're still there, it's just about to raise your hand and someone will let you in.
That's right, or just unmute and speak. We can probably do that. But anyway, I think well, we've just pretty much used our stopping time, but certainly, I'm sure all of you join me in thanking Fabricio for a very stimulating lecture and your work is, I think, extremely important in giving us new insights into some of this period. So I certainly, I'm sure others, but with that, I think we can just thank everyone who's participated and in some virtual way, give a round of applause to Fabricio, and thank you. And we'll hope we can join again in another one of these conversations. Okay.
The weekend is coming. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.